Good morning, everybody. Mr. Campbell here. We're going to talk a little bit about estimating percents. We're about to get into it where we're going to be finding exact percents. So it's good to have an idea of what a reasonable answer is by using our estimating skills. So all we're going to be doing today is estimating, and we'll get into how to find exact answers starting tomorrow. So we're going to put this in the context of a situation that you're going to run into a lot in life, where you need to estimate a percent, but you don't need an exact answer. And that situation is tipping. So if you want to tip somebody, if you want to tip a certain percent, you don't need to find that exact percent, but you should get close to it, and that'll help you leave the kind of tip you want to leave. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to do that today. So let's pretend your family goes to Applebee's. Your bill was $58.36. So you want to leave a 10% tip. How much should you tip your waiter? So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to start by taking our number and we're going to round it. We're going to specifically round it to the tens place. Okay, and you're going to see why in a little bit. So if I take the amount of our bill, which was $58.36, and I round it out to the nearest tens place, remember the tens place is right there. It's the second to the left of the decimal. So I'm going to round to the tens place. Okay. Quick review of Unit 1. The way we do that is we look at the next number. The next number is an 8. Okay, and if the next number is 5 or more, and I remember who's that knocking at my back door? 5 or more, raise the score. Okay, so if the next number is 5 or more, which it is, it's an 8, we're going to round up. So this 5 becomes a 6. So $58.36 to the nearest $10 is $60. Okay, you notice 58 is between 50 and 60, but it's closer to 60. That's why we're rounding up to 60. Okay, so once we have this rounded to nearest 10, what we're going to do is we're going to find 10%. Now the reason we're finding 10% is 10% is a really easy number to find. Okay, 10% is just 1/10. So all we're doing is we're dividing by 10. Okay. Now what I hope you remember is that when we divide a number by 10, all we do is we move the decimal point 1 to the left. Okay. So if you have 60, 10% of this would just be moving the decimal 1 to the left, would make it 6. Okay. If there's a 0 at the end, it just amounts to dropping the 0. And this is why we wanted to round to nearest tens place. So we'd have a 0 at the end that we could just drop. So 10% of 60 is 6. Okay. Therefore, the tip should be about $6. Okay, so we rounded to nearest tens place, and we just divided by 10, which moved the decimal point over 1, to figure out what 10% would be. Well, if you know anything about tipping, you know 10% is not a great tip. An average tip is about 15%. So 10% might be a tip if they didn't do the best job. But let's say they did a great job, and you wanted to find a 20%. So the question is, how can we find 20%? Well, it's going to be the same approach, except there's going to be one extra step at the end. Because what I hope you notice about 20% is 20% is just twice as much as 10%. Okay? So if you have 10% and you double it, now you have 20%, right? Because 10 doubled is 20. So if 10% tip would be $6, if you want a 20% tip, you just multiply by 2 and make that $12. Okay? So 20% tip would just be 2 10% tips, so it's 6 plus another 6, which is 12. Okay, so 20% tip, you're still going to find 10%, then you're just going to double it. Okay. Well, the other thing you might be wondering is, well, what about if they did just an okay job, they did an average job, and you want to leave them a 15% tip? Okay, well, if it's a 15% tip, we're still going to start out the same way. We're going to find out what 10% is. Okay, but then if we have a 10% tip so far, and we want to give them a 15% tip, well, that means we need to add another 5%. Okay, so 5%, if you think about how 5% would compare to 10%, well, 5 is half of 10. right? So if you have 10% to get 5%, you would just have to cut it in half, right? So if 10% is 6, just divide that by 2. That means 5% is 3. Okay? So we can build the tip out of these little bits of 10% and 5%. So if I want 15%, you can think of 15% is 10% plus another 5%, right? Because 10 plus 5 equals 15. Okay, well, we know, let's go over here. We know that 10% is $6. 5% is half of that, which is another $3. 6 plus 3 adds up to $9. So 15% would be $9. Okay, if you're checking to see if that makes sense, please notice that's halfway between what we got for 10% and what we got for 20%, right? Because 15 is halfway between 10 and 20. Okay, so if we're trying to find a percent that is not an even 10, 20, or 30, want to find something that ends with a 5, we're going to need to also cut my 10% in half to figure out what 5% is. And then we can kind of build it out of that. And you'll see what I mean as we go forward. All right, so let's look at this one. Let's say, well, let's say the meal was $42.19. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to round this to the nearest tens place. So if I look in the tens place, I have a 4. The number that comes after it is a 2. 2 tells me to round down. Okay, so this 4 stays a 4. Okay, $42.19 is more than $40, but less than 50. And it's closer to 40. Okay, so that's about 40. Okay, so if I'm going to do my, I'll put that down here. So if I'm going to do my tips, first thing I have to do is find out what 10% is. So 10% equals $4. And I'm taking this 40 and dropping the 0, or moving the decimal over 1. Okay, 1/10 of 40 is 4. Okay, so if I want to leave a 10% tip, I'm going to leave $4. Okay. If I want to leave a 15% tip, remember 15% is just 10% plus another 5%. Okay, well, let's find out what 5% is. If 10% is 4, 5% is half of that. So that's just another 2. Okay. So 15% would be 4 plus another 2, so $6. Okay. If I want to make 20%, well, 20%, remember, is just 2 10%. Okay, because 20 is twice as much as 2. We got 4 times 2, which would be $8. Okay, so there's tips you could leave for a 10%, 15%, or 20% tip. Okay. All right, let's deal with a little fancier meal. Here, this one costs $166.62. First thing we're going to round. Again, we want to round to the nearest $10. So here I have a 6 in my tens place. The number that comes after it is a 6, which means I round up. Okay, so the 6 becomes a 7. So rounded off, this is $170. All right, now if I want to find 10%, let's do 10. I can see I'm going to need to know what 10 and 5% is because I'm doing 15 and 25%. So let's find those right away. So 10% of 170 is just dropping the 0. It's just 17. Okay, 5% is going to be half of that. Well, this is an odd number, so we got to be careful here. We're not going to get a whole number, but that's okay. It's dollars. We can have not whole numbers. So if 10% is 17, half of 17, well, 17 is between 16 and 18. All right, half of 16 is 8. Half of 18 is 9. So this would be 8.5. So 8.5. Okay. So if I want to tip 10%, 10% is just that 17. 15% was 10% plus another 5%. So 17 plus 8.5 Gives you 25.5, so $25.50. Okay. 20% is just two 10%. So that's 17 plus another 17, which is 34. Okay. 25% is 20% plus another 5%. So I know 20% is 34. If I add another 5%, that's 8.5. I'll get 42.50. Okay. So there are those percents of those numbers. Let's give you a chance to try one. Okay, so this next one, let's come up with, instead of having to do this all individually, let's come up with an amount for your bill to be. Let's say your bill is $78.13. Okay, I want you to find a 10, 20, and 15% tip based on this amount, $78.13. All right, so let's pause the video here. And when you have those answers, go ahead and resume. All right, welcome back. Hopefully these are the answers that you got. Okay, $78.13 rounds off to 80 bucks. Okay, 10% of that is 8. Okay, which means 5% is going to be 4. So there's half of that. Okay, we'll need that for the 15. So 10% tip would just be 8 bucks. A 20% tip is 8 plus another 8. It says 10% plus another 10%. That's 16. 15% tip is 10% plus 5%. So 8 plus 4 is $12 for that one. Okay. Now, this applies to just more than just tipping. Okay, tipping is a situation that we've talked about because it's pretty common to find percents there. But sometimes you're going to be looking for less round percents of numbers. And we can apply the same reasoning to these situations to estimate any percent of anything. What you're going to want to do in this case is you're going to round not just your number, but you're going to round your percent to nearest 5 as well. Okay, so that we can use the approach that we were talking about. So if you think about 79%, okay, well, if I'm counting by 5s, I'd go 70, 75, 80, 85. The closest number 79 is to 80. Okay, so 79% is real close to 80%. Okay, then I'm going to round this number also, again, rounding to the nearest tens. So 42, the 2 says round down. Okay, that's about 40. So to find 80% of 40, I'm going to follow the same approach. I'm going to find 10% first. 10% of 40 would just be 4. Okay, and then if I'm trying to make 80%, well, 80% would be 8 times as much as 10%. Right? I need 8 tens to get up to 80. So I'm going to take this 4, and I'm going to multiply by 8. Okay, so it's about 32. I actually don't know if it's money here. Didn't tell me that. So it's about 32. So that's my estimate. All right, let's try this one. 6%. Again, if I'm counting by 5s, I go 5, 10. This is closest to 5. So I'm going to do 5% of, okay, here's my tens place. 8 says to round up. So 118 is about 120. Okay, again, counting by tens, I go 100, 110, 120. That's the one it's closest to. All right, so I want 5% of 120. I'm going to do that the same way. 10% of 120 is just 12, dropping that 0. 5% would be half of that, which is 6. Okay, so it's about 6. Okay, that's what this sign means. It's about equal to. Okay, last one, and this is what the ones on your homework are going to look like. Is just estimating these percents. Okay, 41% is about 40%. To the nearest 5. 601 is real close to 600. So I'm going to find 40% of 600. 10% of 600 is 60. And then I want 40%. So I'm going to multiply that by 4. Right? 4 tens would give me 40. So 60 times 4 is 240. So it's about 240 would be a good estimate there. All right. Good luck. Let me know if you have any questions.